So that means the key question is this: did the lab do some of the research outlined in that proposal? If they did, the act of performing that research would be a prime opportunity for it to escape the lab. But that's where the trail has gone a bit colder, and speculation has filled the void. So EcoHealth claims it never performed any of the research. Yet scientists The Intercept spoke to said it would be highly unusual to apply for funding for research before having done even a small amount of it. But that leaves us with a he said, she said. Now, the Vanity Fair story moves the question forward in an interesting way. So again, for background, the DARPA grant was put together in collaboration with Ralph Baric, a UNC virologist known as one of the best in the world, and it drew on controversial gain-of-function research he'd done in 2015 that set off alarm bells in the scientific community and that even he acknowledged was extremely risky. Now, the Wuhan researchers were also heavily involved in putting that grant proposal together. What we also now know is that the Chinese military was collaborating with the researchers in the lab, something that had previously been denied by Shi Zhengli, the Chinese scientist who ran that part of the lab. Here's how Catherine Eben of Vanity Fair put it. Quote, if China's military had been collaborating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology scientists, it's unclear if Peter Daszak would have realized it. He had far less visibility into the lab than he let on, a former EcoHealth Alliance staffer told Vanity Fair. The work being done there was, quote, always an enigma, unquote, the former staffer said. The nonprofit had hired a U.S.-based Chinese national who helped, quote, interpret for them what was happening inside the WIV, but we had to take everything at face value. It was more, accept what it is because of this relationship between Xi and Daszak. Quote, he doesn't know what happened in that lab, said the former staffer. Quote, he cannot know that. Eben quotes virologist Simon Wayne Hobson saying that the DARPA proposal was, quote, basically a roadmap to a SARS-CoV-2-like virus. Wayne Hobson noted that if the research had the blessing of somebody like Baric, then, quote, it is possible the WIV would have wanted to copy what it viewed as cutting-edge science. Wayne Hobson added, that doesn't mean they did it, but it means it's legitimate to ask the question. So in other words, EcoHealth had no idea what research was going on there, and it's entirely logical that the scientists there would have put the paper into practice. So Daszak's denial is more than useless. It's actively deceptive. The question then is, how likely is it that these Chinese scientists working with the People's Liberation Army used Baric's roadmap and took the viruses out for a spin? Well, here's an even better question. Why would they not have done that? All the incentives are lined up. Doing groundbreaking research using a top virologist roadmap is a sure path to advancement. Making technological breakthroughs based on Western IP or research is how the Chinese economy grows. It would be stranger if they didn't do some of that research. Now, we also know that the pandemic started a little more than a year after the proposal was submitted. The timing all lines up. So add to this the fact that the Chinese government has been generally uncooperative and has been removing evidence from public databases, which we talked about earlier in the show today. Now, it's of course possible that this is all an insane string of total coincidences. But while there's now a completely coherent theory of how the virus jumped from the lab, there's nothing similar on the natural side. The proponents of the natural origin theory haven't yet identified how the virus made the jump, despite a big New York Times story that claimed as much in its headline recently, but then backed away from it lower in the story. In the past, scientists have been able to figure out the origin species pretty quickly. And now look, researchers should of course keep investigating, as there are still questions we don't have answers to. But as of now, a straightforward explanation has emerged. The U.S. funded pioneering gain-of-function research in 2015. Those researchers collaborated with colleagues in Wuhan. They continued the research there. It slipped out. We got a pandemic, and millions of people died. That can't yet be said with absolute certainty, but it's now far and away the most likely explanation.
You know, it's funny, when I was reading the article about the Black Swan stuff, I thought about like one of my favorite 30 Rock episodes where Tracy Morgan is talking to Larry King about the financial markets in Asia, which he clearly knows nothing about. And he says, Larry, I am not an expert, but I do have a strong opinion. And that's kind of where I am right now. Like, I think Denise said it right. Like, this is record-breaking profiteering. And I want people to really remember that, because these same forces that are raking in record profits are also kind of funding the sort of propaganda arm of this assault that is trying to convince us that rising, prices, the kind of inflation squeeze that working people are feeling right now is just the result of kind of acts of God, right? Like the COVID-19 pandemic, like the war in Ukraine, things that we have no control over. But if you look closely, you will see that companies like Exxon and the oil industry writ large, they have been jacking up stock buybacks and dividends over the past year. They are absolutely taking advantage of this geopolitical crisis to stuff their pockets with as much money as they possibly can, while consumers momentarily have the ability to pay it. I think that's one thing that we should remember, is that actually what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was bipartisan. Trump started it, Biden kind of continued it. But what the government did was it injected money directly into people's pockets, not just with the stimulus checks, but also the child tax credits, the unextended employment benefits, so on and so forth. And we saw historic drops in poverty momentarily. Now we are seeing the ruling class claw that all back by deliberately jacking up prices. And the inflation has already outpaced wage growth over the past year. Meanwhile, corporate profits rose 37%, which is the most since the Fed started tracking that data, the biggest rise in a single year since like 1948. CEOs are on earnings calls bragging about how they've been jacking up prices on all of us. And, we're just going to like sit here and wait for a bigger recession to fall on our heads. It is class war, right? Richard Wolff famously said this to me on the Real News Network. He said inflation is a form of class war. And I think that's what we are seeing. This is not just an act of God. This is not the market doing what it is. This is people profiting off of death and despair and disruption. And we're all getting screwed like we always do.
We've never seen this level of information warfare before from the U.S. government. And what they're doing is they're trying to preempt the Russians, get ahead of Russian disinformation, even mess with Vladimir Putin's brain, as one person put it, leave him off balance to try to show that the United States knows what Russia is up to and is going to get ahead of it. It's really rather remarkable. Another example was when they announced that Russia had gone to China to ask for help with getting some weapons. That hasn't come to pass yet, and it was almost a way of putting China on notice. Hey, we know what's going on here. Don't let this happen. So really interesting and unprecedented use of intelligence here, Allison.
Yeah, Ken, as you just said, not just intelligence here, unprecedented use. One U.S. official telling you it doesn't even have to be solid intelligence when we talk about it. It's more important to get out ahead of them. Putin specifically, before they do something, it's preventative.
It doesn't even have to be solid intelligence when they tell us about it, they said. Shouldn't it, though? Shouldn't our government be giving us solid information instead of rumors or conjecture? They say they're fighting an information war against what? Misinformation? Well, who is the one spreading misinformation? But they did it to deter Russia and mess with Vladimir Putin's brain, they said. So it's okay. Well, maybe you could justify it because of the invasion. But what about China? They decided to bring them into it and put them on notice also, as if provoking one nuclear power wasn't enough. So they admit the narrative that Russia planned to use chemical weapons and that they were going to get weapons from China was not based on solid intelligence. But it doesn't have to be. They can say whatever they want, apparently. This is exactly why so many people don't believe the news or the intelligence community anymore. So much of what we see and hear ends up being manufactured propaganda in an attempt to manipulate. This type of propaganda doesn't just manipulate Putin, it manipulates the American people as well, probably even more so. Do you think Putin is falling for this? Don't you think he would know if it was a lie that he was planning to use chemical weapons or get help from China? He knows what's truthful about him and what isn't, but the American people don't. So I don't think this type of propaganda is intended to mess with Putin as much as it is to mess with us. When people envision atrocities like chemical weapons being used on innocent men, women, and children, they're rightfully horrified. Sure, they say the goal is to put Putin on notice, but perhaps the real goal is to get us to feel so disgusted by another country's behavior that we begin to think war is the only option. Remember babies being thrown out of incubators and weapons of mass destruction? These were the lies used to march us into Iraq. But truthfully, it doesn't matter if we're the ones fighting the war or if it's someone else, so as long as we supply it. War is great for everyone except those fighting in it. It's great for politicians who see surges in approval ratings. They get to seem strong. It's obviously great for the military-industrial complex. They get to sell massive amounts of weapons. And it's great for the news business and the oil companies. Even them, they're raking in record profits. All right, so you might be thinking, well, they're often wrong, but give them a break. It's a tough job trying to read other people's minds. And they did get the Russian invasion of Ukraine right, so maybe they're more inside of Putin's head than we give them credit for. But are they? Watch this.
By saying to the world that U.S. intelligence shows that Russia is poised to invade, that was a big risk, because if they had been wrong, we would all be saying, oh, there's another case where U.S. intelligence blew it, Iraq WMD, and now this. But they were right. And as a matter of fact, for example, France, the military intelligence agency there, they predicted that Russia would not invade. The head of that agency had to resign over that. So that was a great call, a risky call, though.
A risky call. Oh, so they're gambling. They didn't actually know Russia was going to invade. It just looked like it. So they took the opportunity to claim they were. They got lucky. They were right. You have to be kidding me. But honestly, it makes perfect sense. Many of us did not believe Russia was going to invade because, as Ken Delanian stated, the French head of intelligence claimed it wasn't going to happen and ended up resigning over it. I don't see why, when the German head of intelligence didn't think they would either. In fact, they were in Kiev at the time of the invasion and had to be evacuated. Even Zelensky himself didn't think the invasion was going to happen. He was making jokes about it on Facebook. The U.S. was the only intelligence agency to call it, but it turns out it wasn't because they knew. It was just typical American warmongering that happened to be right this time. Lucky guess. So my question is, when we hear reports like this, that the intelligence is flimsy, but that they report it as fact anyway, why is anyone surprised to find out American trust in the intelligence sector is dwindling?